3 little girls went to sleep, never knowing they would never wake up again. In the quiet suburbs of Jacksonville, Florida, a tragedy unfolded that left an entire community shaken. A 16-year-old girl, the last person anyone would suspect, committed an unthinkable crime, murdering her 3 younger sisters in the dead of night. What could drive a teenager to commit such a horrific act? The Morales family lived in a quiet neighborhood in Orlando, Florida. From the outside, their home looked like any other in the suburbs. Freshly mowed lawn, a neat driveway, and a porch decorated with seasonal wreaths. Inside, however, there was tension no visitor could see. Valeria Morales, 16, was the eldest of 4 sisters. She was quiet, reserved, and spent most of her time in her room, sketching in her notebook or staring out of the window. Her sisters, Gabriela, 14, Isabel, 10, and Lucia, 6, were vibrant, always filling the house with laughter. But where there was warmth, there was also resentment. Valeria had always been different from her siblings. She lacked the charm of Gabriela, the innocence of Isabel, and the sweetness of Lucia. She felt like an outsider in her own home, an invisible shadow cast by the brightness of her sisters. Her mother, Elena Morales, often scolded her for isolating herself, comparing her to Gabriela, who excelled in school and had a circle of friends. Their father, Carlos, worked long hours at a construction company, coming home exhausted, paying little attention to the growing divide in his family. Something inside Valeria was changing. She wasn't just angry. She was planning. The night of June 17, 2024, was suffocating. The heat pressed against the walls, making it unbearable to sleep. Valeria lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She heard her sisters giggling down the hall. That laughter felt like nails digging into her skin. She had written about it in her journal, how they didn't deserve the life they had, how they were obstacles in her way, how the world would be quieter without them. At 2:34 a.m., she slipped out of bed, barefoot, moving like a shadow through the house. The house was eerily quiet at this time of night, the only sounds coming from the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint murmur of traffic outside. Valeria walked through the hallway, the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet muffled by the thick carpet. Her room was at the far end of the hall, away from her sisters' bedrooms, but she knew exactly where they were. Gabriela was likely curled up with her phone, texting friends or scrolling through social media. Isabel, the middle child, was probably buried under blankets, reading a book or watching TV. Lucia, the youngest, would be asleep, her soft snores filling the air. Valeria's mind raced as she approached the first door. Gabriela's. She paused briefly, taking a deep breath. Her pulse quickened. The anger she had kept hidden for so long bubbled up to the surface. All those years of feeling ignored, dismissed, overshadowed. It was time for it all to end. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. She had planned this moment over and over in her mind, rehearsing every step, every action. In the darkness, she had imagined the faces of her sisters, their laughter, their smiles, their innocence, and she had felt rage like nothing she had ever known. She turned the handle and slipped inside. Gabriela's room was dimly lit by a nightlight in the corner, casting a soft glow across the walls. The older sister was asleep in her bed, curled on her side, her phone resting on the nightstand. The sight of her, so peaceful, so unaware, only deepened Valeria's anger. She reached into the drawer of her dresser, where she had hidden a knife earlier that evening. It was a sharp, silver blade, the kind her father used for cutting vegetables. She had chosen it carefully, weighing its size and weight, deciding it would be the most effective. She gripped it tightly, feeling the coldness of the steel as she approached Gabriela's bed. The first strike was quick, a blur of motion. Gabriela stirred but didn't wake. Valeria couldn't believe how easy it was. Too easy. She drove the knife deeper, silencing any screams before they had a chance to form. The blood seeped quickly through the sheets, staining the white fabric with an awful dark red. It wasn't until Gabriela's body lay motionless that Valeria took a step back, breathing heavily, the reality of her actions starting to settle in. But there was no time to dwell on the aftermath. There were others. Isabel and Lucia. Valeria crept down the hall, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved like a predator, each step calculated, her mind completely fixated on what she had already done and what she still had to finish. Isabel's door was slightly ajar. The soft glow from her desk lamp lit up the room, casting long shadows across the walls. She was lying on her stomach, reading, oblivious to the danger that loomed just beyond the doorframe. Valeria stood there for a moment, watching her sister's quiet movements. A part of her hesitated, just for an instant, but the anger surged again. She couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Isabel's eyes never saw her coming. The knife struck again, and this time Valeria was almost numb to the violence. There was no regret, no remorse, just a need to finish what she had started. Isabel's body collapsed in a heap on the floor, her book sliding from her hand as her life was taken. As the sound of Isabel's final breath filled the room, Valeria turned toward the last door. Lucia's room. Lucia was the youngest, only 6 years old. She wasn't even old enough to understand what had happened to her sisters. In a twisted way, Valeria felt something akin to pity as she stepped into her room. Lucia was sleeping soundly in her bed, clutching a stuffed bunny to her chest. She looked so innocent, so fragile, but Valeria's mind had already been made up. The girl had to go. Valeria stood over the small bed, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand. She raised it above Lucia's head, her body frozen in that single moment of indecision. Lucia stirred, but only slightly, shifting in her sleep. For just a heartbeat, Valeria thought she might stop, just walk away, leave the room, leave everything behind. But the thought of stopping was unbearable. The rage she had carried for so long, the bitterness that had built up inside her, demanded this final act. Without another thought, Valeria drove the knife down into Lucia's small body. There was no fight, no scream. Lucia simply stopped moving, the softness of her skin giving way to the force of the blow, and just like that, it was done. Valeria stood in the room, her mind racing but her body still. The silence that followed the chaos felt suffocating. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she slowly backed out of the room, the blood from her sisters now staining her clothes. It was a finality she couldn't escape, a moment of irreversible horror. She went to the bathroom and washed her hands, her face pale, the events of the night already fading into a numbness that took over. She couldn't think. She couldn't feel. It was as if she had stepped outside of her body, watching herself from a distance as she tried to wash away the physical evidence of her actions. But there was no escaping the truth. The horror she had unleashed in the house would soon reach the outside world, and Valeria knew she couldn't hide forever. As the clock struck 5 a.m., the quiet of the night was broken by the sound of sirens in the distance, the beginning of a nightmare that no one could have predicted. The bodies of Gabriella, Isabel, and Lucia were discovered just hours later, a chilling scene of violence and betrayal that would haunt the Morales family forever. The police arrived at the house. The questions they asked met with silence, as they pieced together the fragments of a crime that no one could fathom. Valeria was taken into custody, her once quiet and isolated life now shattered into a million pieces. The world would soon learn the chilling truth that the girl who had been lost in her anger, her jealousy, and her bitterness had turned that pain into something tragic. Pause for a moment. You've made it this far, but ask yourself, how well do you really know the people closest to you? Could someone in your own home be hiding a secret dark enough to change everything? Stay tuned, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories. By the time the sun rose over the quiet neighborhood in Jacksonville, Florida, the Morales house had become a crime scene swarming with investigators, officers, and forensic specialists. The flashing red and blue lights reflected against the wet pavement as neighbors stood at a distance, whispering among themselves, unable to comprehend the horror that had unfolded inside. The discovery of the 3 bodies had left officers shaken. It was clear from the beginning that this wasn't the work of an outsider. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms, no missing valuables. Just 3 lifeless sisters and a single surviving sibling. It didn't take long before suspicion turned toward Valeria. She had been found sitting in the kitchen when the authorities arrived, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her clothes were stained, the metallic scent of blood still fresh in the air. When asked what had happened, she didn't answer. She simply stared ahead, her dark eyes vacant, as if she had already disconnected from reality. Detectives led her outside, where she was placed in the back of a police vehicle. She didn't resist. She didn't ask any questions. The only time she reacted was when they drove past the crowd of onlookers gathered at the edge of the street. That was when she finally looked up, her expression unreadable. At the police station, investigators began piecing together the events of the night. The forensic team worked methodically, photographing the crime scene, collecting samples, and studying the patterns of violence that marked each room. Blood spatter analysis confirmed that the attack had been premeditated. Each strike calculated, each victim chosen deliberately. In the interrogation room, Valeria sat across from Detective Alan Rousseau, a seasoned officer with over 2 decades of experience handling violent crimes. He had seen hardened criminals, career killers, men and women who showed no remorse for their actions. But Valeria was different. She was just a teenager, a girl who should have been worried about school, friendships, and normal teenage struggles. Instead, she was sitting in front of him, accused of a crime so brutal it defied comprehension. The first few hours were spent in silence. She refused to speak, her gaze fixated on the table in front of her. It wasn't until they brought in a family member, her aunt, Mariana Morales, that she showed any reaction. Mariana had rushed to the station the moment she heard what had happened. She had been the first relative contacted since their parents were away in Puerto Rico visiting extended family. When Mariana entered the room, her face was streaked with tears, her hands trembling. She could barely look at Valeria, struggling to process the reality of what had taken place. The sight of her broken, grieving aunt seemed to chip away at Valeria's silence. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers tightening into fists. But still, she said nothing. Over the next few days, investigators uncovered disturbing details about Valeria's relationship with her sisters. Witnesses came forward, recalling moments of tension, conflicts that had seemed harmless at the time but now carried a much darker weight. Teachers described her as quiet, withdrawn, but highly intelligent. She excelled in academics but rarely engaged with her classmates. Her diary, recovered from her bedroom, painted an unsettling picture. Pages filled with resentment, words laced with bitterness toward her siblings, accusations of favoritism, feelings of being overshadowed. She had written about feeling invisible, about wanting to be free from the shadow of her sisters. The most chilling entry, dated just a week before the murders, read, "I wonder what it would feel like if they were gone. Would I finally matter? Would anyone finally see me?" That single sentence sent shivers down the spines of investigators. It wasn't just anger. It was a calculated thought, a question she had pondered long before she made it a reality. Meanwhile, the community struggled to process the tragedy. News of the crime spread quickly, making headlines across the country. Everyone wanted to understand how a 16-year-old girl, raised in a loving home, could commit such an act. Psychological experts weighed in, speculating about possible mental illness, deep-seated trauma, or suppressed emotions that had erupted in the most violent way possible. At the Morales household, funeral arrangements were being made. The sight of 3 white coffins lined up at the front of the church left mourners in tears. The family sat in silence, their grief too heavy for words. Valeria's parents, who had returned from Puerto Rico as soon as they received the news, were inconsolable. They had left home believing their children were safe. Now, 3 were gone, and the 4th was behind bars, accused of being the one responsible. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Valeria's legal team attempted to argue that she was suffering from severe psychological distress. They claimed she had endured years of emotional neglect, that she had been battling an undiagnosed mental disorder, and that on the night of the crime, she had experienced a complete break from reality. But prosecutors painted a different picture. They described her actions as cold, deliberate, and without remorse. The way she had planned the attack, the way she had executed it without hesitation, it all pointed to premeditation. She wasn't a victim of her own mind. She was a predator who had made a conscious decision to eliminate her sisters. The trial was set to begin within months, and the case quickly became one of the most widely followed in Florida's history. People wanted justice for Gabriela, Isabel, and Lucia. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what could drive a 16-year-old girl to commit such an unspeakable act. Meanwhile, Valeria remained in custody, awaiting her fate. The world outside continued to talk about her, analyze her, dissect every aspect of her life. But she didn't care. She no longer had to live in her sister's shadow. She had finally become the center of attention. But at what cost? As the trial date approached, the weight of Valeria Morales' crime hung over Jacksonville like an unshakable fog. The courthouse became the epicenter of one of Florida's most chilling cases, drawing reporters, legal experts, and true crime enthusiasts from across the country. Everyone wanted a front-row seat to the trial of the teenager who had brutally ended the lives of her 3 younger sisters. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the harrowing details. They presented crime scene photos, forensic evidence, and excerpts from Valeria's diary. The jury listened, their faces reflecting a mix of horror and disbelief. The lead prosecutor, Denise Holloway, delivered a striking opening statement. This was not an act of impulse. This was a plan carried out by a girl who knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. The defense, however, painted a vastly different picture. They brought in psychiatrists and behavioral analysts who testified that Valeria had exhibited signs of severe emotional distress for years. According to their findings, she had been battling undiagnosed depression, severe anxiety, and possible dissociative episodes. One expert, Dr. Leonard Fields, suggested that Valeria's perception of her sisters had become so distorted that she saw them as adversaries rather than family. Testimonies from former teachers, family friends, and classmates revealed another layer of the story. Valeria had always been different, brilliant but withdrawn, observant but emotionally detached. Those who had known her described a girl who rarely displayed affection, who kept her emotions buried deep beneath an exterior of quiet indifference. But one piece of evidence stood out among the rest: a chilling note found inside her school locker, written just days before the murders. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Freedom comes at a price. Sometimes that price is blood. The courtroom fell silent as the words were read aloud. Even Valeria's own defense team struggled to spin it in her favor. If she had been mentally unwell, how could she have been so methodical? How could she have calculated every move with such precision? As the trial progressed, it became clear that the jury was leaning toward conviction. The emotional testimony of Valeria's parents solidified their stance. Her mother, Carmen Morales, spoke through tears, clutching a photo of her 3 slain daughters. "I don't understand what happened to my child. She was supposed to love them, protect them, not," her voice broke, "not take them away from us." Her father, Alejandro Morales, could barely look at his surviving daughter. His once unwavering belief in her innocence had crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The final blow came when prosecutors played the 911 call made by Valeria in the aftermath of the murders. The recording captured her voice, calm, detached, utterly devoid of emotion. "They're dead," she had said matter-of-factly to the dispatcher. "You should send someone." No panic, no regret, just a cold acknowledgement of what she had done. On the final day of the trial, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the brutality of the crime, the meticulous planning, the complete lack of remorse. The defense pleaded for leniency, arguing that Valeria's mind had been fractured long before that fateful night. It took the jury less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. When the judge read the decision, guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, Valeria showed no visible reaction, no tears, no anger, no relief. She stood motionless as the sentence was handed down. 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, others cried, but Valeria remained expressionless. The girl who had spent her entire life feeling invisible had now become infamous. With the trial over, the Morales family attempted to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives. The home where the tragedy occurred was sold within months, its dark history driving down its value. Neighbors no longer spoke of the murders openly, but the whispers never truly faded. Valeria was transferred to a maximum security correctional facility, where she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Journalists attempted to secure interviews, hoping to get inside the mind of the teenager who had committed one of Florida's most shocking crimes. She refused every request. Years passed, but the case remained a subject of fascination. Books were written, documentaries dissected every detail. Psychologists debated whether she had been a cold-blooded killer or a deeply disturbed girl in need of help. But one question continued to haunt those who followed the case. Did Valeria ever feel remorse? According to a former prison guard, the answer was no. "I watched her for years," he later revealed in an interview. "She never cried. She never spoke about her sisters. It was like they never existed." Whatever had driven Valeria to commit such an unspeakable act remained locked away within her, an enigma even time couldn't unravel. The Morales family's nightmare had ended in the courtroom, but the scars it left behind would never fully heal. And Valeria? She had achieved what she had longed for, eternal recognition, but at a price so steep that no one would ever envy the cost. If this story has kept you on edge, imagine what's coming next. Don't miss out on more chilling true crime stories that will leave you questioning everything. Subscribe now for more interesting stories.